Hey everybody, welcome back. So today we're going to be focusing on cyber terrorism. We're going to try to dig in, get an understanding of what it means, how we define it, what are the probabilities of cyber attacks. And to do this, I thought a really good way would be to look at how particular experts have talked about it. So I have three interviews that I'm going to show you. One is with an individual who is a professor who studies particularly the issue of cyber terrorism. The second video I'm going to show you looks at the issue of cyber terrorism as an interview with a number of individuals, particularly who work for important private IT companies. I think that'll be a good way to start thinking as well about the private sector's involvement in cyber terrorism. And then finally, the last interview was with a cybersecurity expert, cyber terrorism expert, who's a law professor at the University of Utah. And I think all three of these individuals are going to provide some interesting perspectives for you all to start thinking about and trying to understand cyber terrorism. But before we jump in and listen to what they want to say, I want to frame the way we think about it and think about this topic at the outset. And we run into a number of difficulties when we try to define cyber terrorism, just like when we have tried to define terrorism. And this is something I want you to keep in mind. Think about the different ways that these scholars, professors, members of the private sector talk about cyber terrorism and see if they're talking about it in the same way. See what you think your definition of cyber terrorism. Think about all these things when you're going through, and just to give you a baseline definition to think about, and then you think about what you find wrong with this definition potentially, and then does it fit in the way that the various interviewees talk about cyber terrorism in the videos. See how well it fits into their framing of cyber terrorism. So the definition here is the premeditated use of disruptive activities or the threat thereof against computers and or networks with the intention to cause harm or further social, ideological, religious, political, or similar objectives, or to intimidate any person in the furtherance of such objectives. So let's start out. We're going to watch his first interview with this professor from King's College talking about what is cyber terrorism, whether he thinks it's a threat or not, and how we should go about trying to, in some ways, potentially address it. So let's jump right in.
Have we ever seen an act of cyber terrorism? If you ask scholars and academics who study cyber attacks and cybersecurity, the response is 50% say yes and 50% say no, we have never seen an act of cyber terrorism. So what is cyber terrorism? Cyber attacks fall into four different categories. There's crime, which shall not concern us today, cybercrime, although it's the biggest of all. There's espionage, using the internet, computers to spy on companies or states. There's thirdly subversion, hacktivism, that would include militants who are socializing with other militants online. That could be lone wolves, finding out what kind of targets to attack, orienting themselves about ideology. And fourthly, there's cyber sabotage, actually using computer code to attack targets. So what is cyber terrorism? I would say cyber terrorism is clearly sabotage, attacking critical infrastructure, for instance, bringing down the financial markets, terrorizing people through the use of computer code. So have we ever seen an act of cyber terrorism if we define it as cyber sabotage? The answer is no. We've never seen a militant group using computer attack to achieve a kinetic or violent effect. That just hasn't happened yet. There are very few computer attacks that have achieved a violent physical effect. In fact, there's only one external attack that has ever achieved that, Stuxnet, and that was a state operation. So what about the risk? Is there a real risk of militants using cyber attack to attack critical infrastructure? The answer is yes, there is a very clear risk. The risk is real, and this could happen. So first we have to understand how secure our utility companies, is the electrical grid, how secure are power plants, how secure are financial markets. The computer systems that these companies are using, the systems that run things that move fast and that can burn and explode, these systems are by design oftentimes insecure. They're built to be safe in terms of they're built to run permanently, to be safe for an industrial plant or a chemical plant, but they're not built to be secure. So the systems are, for experts, relatively easy to crush, which then raises the big question: why haven't we seen an act of computer sabotage by militants yet? Why haven't we seen an act of cyber terrorism yet? And the answer is controversial and complicated. We can say that right now, those with the capabilities to cause physical harm through computer attack do not have the intention. Those with the capabilities don't have the intention. And those with the intention don't have the capabilities. So terrorists, militants, we can assume have the intention, but right now don't have the capabilities, the engineering skills, and the target intelligence to cause physical harm. So let's look at how easy it is to cause physical harm through a computer attack for a moment. How easy would cyber terrorism be? Any organization or any individual that tries to, say, cause a blackout would need two things. One, target intelligence about a specific target system to be attacked, and the skills, the software or engineering skills to do so. One is relatively easy to get. The skills can be acquired, from textbooks, from training sessions, etc. It's not that hard to do this. But the target intelligence, for the most secure and for the most sensible, for the most high-profile targets, the target intelligence is relatively difficult to get. Again, let's take Stuxnet as an example, the attack on Iran's nuclear enrichment program. The most critical part was getting the target intelligence with very precise figures about rotating speeds inside the plant, and design the weapon, design the attack in a way that allowed physical effect. So the next question then is, how about the future? What about these critical infrastructure systems that are standardized? Is there a potential for a generic computer attack on critical infrastructure that doesn't require detailed target information? That is a very difficult question to answer. Right now, I think the trend is that such an attack is getting slightly easier for a number of reasons, because mainly the information is more easily and more publicly available. So the attacks are getting easier, and at the same time, knowledge of how to do this is spreading. So bottom line is, I would expect an act of cyber terrorism is certainly within the realm of the possible, within the realm of the thinkable. But let me end on an optimistic note. What's the benefit of cyber terrorism? I think the benefit from a militant's point of view of a computer attack is overstated. Violence is an emotional thing to happen. If you cause a blackout, or if you delete data on a hard drive in a company, that will cause that will make people angry. It will be a nuisance, certainly, but it's not the same thing as exploding a suicide vest in a crowded public space. So by definition, computer attacks are less violent because the violence is very much mediated. You have to weaponize the target system than old-style terrorist attacks. So perhaps it is over-optimistic to assume that militants realize the limitations of computer attack in terms of the emotional impact. But I do think the ultimate possibility of terrorizing people through cyber attack is more limited than we think it is.
Okay, so I hope that you enjoyed the first video. Posed some interesting questions there, right? Thinking about how we think about how we define cyber terrorism. Should we be as concerned about it? Does it have the same resonance as other types of terrorism? And so, to sort of conclude and wrap this up, I thought an interesting question for your first discussion question from this video would be to ask you: Is there such a thing as cyber terrorism? Why or why not? So again, discussion question 1: Is there such a thing as cyber terrorism? Why or why not? So think a little bit more about some of the elements that he talked about, and now you're going to be watching another video. And this is the video where there's an interview with various individuals in the private sector and the IT sector who are going to talk about the issue of cyber terrorism, how it should be addressed, and I think this will be a good follow-up to that initial intro into cyber terrorism. So I hope you enjoy.
Hello. Cyber terrorism, defined as politically motivated acts of deliberate, large-scale disruption of computer networks, is on the rampage. It's become so serious that governments are making statements about how worried they are about it. So what can be done? Can governments do anything? And can we fight back? We asked a number of IT industry heavyweights for their understanding of potential solutions. But first, what's their view of the problem?
First of all, security needs to be viewed as an end-to-end problem. It needs to be viewed from application to the devices that connect to network security and firewall, all the way into the data center and the application itself. Unless you view security holistically, we're not going to be able to get on top of it.
Governments have some pretty serious challenges when we talk about cyber. We think about the Cold War and the idea of government versus government. It was very that sort of James Bond spies, very skilled professionals doing operations on each other. When you look at the cyber realm and cybersecurity, we are talking about attackers who have the ability for individual who have a political agenda to operate on those, to attack the government, and we still have the state-sponsored threat. So governments are put in a difficult position because how do they dedicate their resources? Do they dedicate to the potentially very well-trained, very dangerous nation states? Or do they focus their efforts on more individual radicals even that can easily get hold of cyber attacks and use them against critical infrastructure or use them for just propaganda purposes?
I think what you've seen attacks that we've seen previously from ideological groups like Anonymous and Lulzsec and a few other groups that we saw over a period of time. Those groups, those types of attacks, still ideologically motivated, but by groups that have been engaged in more sort of physical and kinetic attacks, are now moving into the cyber regime. And you've seen the attacks against French television, and you've seen the sort of very strong advocacy in the cyber domain, whether it be on Twitter or on Facebook. Cyber is an interesting domain in that that one's reach is only constrained by one's ability to connect to the internet, and one's ability to engage in activity is only constrained by the technical education of the attacker. And of course, the skill set is one that has been sort of widely created, and understanding that skill set is something that we need to be prepared to defend against is very, very important.
The problem itself is not a new problem. People have been protesting governments since the Roman times, since governments existed. Hacking and attacks is just a form of protest now. It's because I can. Instead of a sign, I now have my keyboard and trying to cause chaos. And I see that's not going to change. Nothing you can really do will change that mindset.
Okay, but what, if anything, can be done about it?
What can be done is more proactive analytics that effectively stop the attacks before they're going to happen. And we have some very advanced software as a service kind of tools like SecureWorks from Dell that actually do this thing, and they actually warn the enterprises of an upcoming attack, and you can effectively take advantage of preventing them before it occurs. Right? It's too late after you spill your milk.
We've seen a couple things that governments are working on to help improve that industry level communication, and that's really a huge first step, is to ensure that governments, industries, and private citizens and users, businesses are all working together to improve their cybersecurity infrastructure and their solutions in place. But another thing that is really key is certainly at the military level, government is very good at protecting itself, but ensuring that protection goes all the way down through state and local government and civilian organizations that really have not typically had the funding of some of the other well-regarded government agencies. The government needs to do a better job. Governments all over the world need to do a much better job of ensuring that even the smallest agencies are still getting cyber attention.
The ability to defend against attacks from opponents is one that is a basic responsibility of government. I think that as governments expand and mature their cyber capabilities, I mean, you've certainly seen very sophisticated capabilities in the US. You've seen a development of that in a number of other countries. Action can be taken, but there is a degree of responsibility on organizations to also maintain and provide an appropriate posture themselves, so they aren't just simply easy prey. And that posture and those measures that they take will protect them from criminal activity as well. So you can't just assume that because someone's a victim of cyber terrorism that they can abrogate responsibility. There's a degree of they need to have appropriate security controls in place, and then you need to have a degree of government response and a degree of government involvement who can deal with the intelligence and the counterintelligence side of it.
You have to come to the realization that cyber threats and cyber attacks on governments will never not stop. So what can be done about it is preparedness. How can you, as a government or organization, be prepared for the cyber attacks? So it's a matter of building up your resilience, to the attacks, building up your expertise, bringing people on board to your government, and basically create a armed service around cybersecurity.
But how can governments help to enhance security against cyber attacks?
I think it's a question of government policies, technology adoption and innovation, and making sure that standards and policies are adhered to, not just within the U.S. but across internationally. So there's a lot of joint work that the private sector, the regulators, the industry, and the global organizations have to do to improve the definition, monitoring, and eventually taking it down. And it's a holistic problem.
The primary way that we see governments working to enhance against cyber attacks and to protect is through industry partnership. They simply have to get closer with the vendor community and other businesses, both public and private, to ensure that they are keeping ahead and on top of the latest threats. We hear the word information sharing a lot. It's been a common theme for many, many years, and governments have struggled with it. There's been some progress made, and we must continue to go down that path to ensure that governments and private enterprises and even citizens are all working together to solve the problem.
Government always has a role to play. I mean, the issue with cyber is that overly rapid standardization leaves a very, very static defense, and so there is a need for government to encourage investment, to encourage development, encourage workforce creation. And I mean, the human resource element is constantly a problem in the cyberspace. Government can also assist with creating and helping drive innovation. We've seen a lot of innovation in the last few years in the cybersecurity space, which is something we hadn't seen for a lengthy period of time. And so as we have more innovative companies providing the ability to respond, protect, and deal with these cyber issues, government can help sort of sponsor and nurture that market. They can help sponsor and nurture the market for human resources. And all of these things then flow on to organizations that have less overarching control and less ability to influence that broader sort of macro requirements. And then, of course, organizations themselves can then take advantage of those skills and those technologies. Some government involvement in things is valuable, but over involvement is certainly, particularly in a very, very fast responding market like cyber, is simply going to lead to an inflexible and intractable problem.
I guess governments to enhance their security and their resilience is really to have to replay that. You have to test for that. You have to know that it's coming. Hire people to attack you. Create a challenge to attack, to try to break through and be able to fight that off. I know at least the U.S. government, they have cyber ranges, much like a war games with battle with armed forces. They have a cyber range with cyber troops, where they have a red team and a blue team that attack each other, and they fend each other off. I think governments probably need to adopt something along those lines to build up their cyber troops and their cyber armed forces to help prevent, those cyber attacks.
But when do you foresee the situation improving?
I actually see the situation improving even today. We have seen a number of initiatives that have sprung up over the years that putting industry and government organizations working together. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's going to be continual improvement over the next, who knows how long. But I do believe that we are making progress towards solving some of the problems today.
I mean, I think unfortunately we're still a number of years away from an improved situation because we still have this dearth of the human resources, and a lot of these sort of companies like ourselves have grown. We're beginning to provide protection and capability to companies out there, but it takes a while for these companies to respond, to be able to deliver improved capabilities, and for them to protect themselves. So over the next several years, I think we're going to see a fundamental change. You're seeing that change now in how people talk about security, how people talk about the importance of information security, and we need to see that continue for the next few years, because change takes time, and it takes time for them to remediate, a number of years of neglect.
I honestly don't see the situation improving. It's in fact going to get worse, and as governments do things in the digital age, with social media and things becoming a lot more visible to everybody, people are always going to have an agenda. You can't make everybody happy. And the fact that the cyber attacks are now anonymous, where in the past you would have to be physically there protesting, get arrested, here there's a level of obscurity that will allow people to do a lot more harmful things. So I see it ongoing, and governments are going to have to, around the world, are going to have to build up their resilience to it.
The smart guys that build software and systems to prevent it, there are equally smart guys who try to defeat it. So for every 10 steps we take forward, there will be 8 steps that we'll have to take backwards. So eventually it's a question of, what is secure enough, and how do you eventually get there? And, I don't have a crystal ball.
So security will continue to be an issue, and it behoves all of us to remain vigilant.
So, hope you enjoyed that and gave you some different perspectives than the original presenter. Think about some of the things that they talked about that were different. Think about the different individuals' perceptions of how likely the threat is going to be, to everyday lives, how much of a concern it should be. Also think about the ways they talked about it differently. I mean, in this one, they drifted in some elements back and forth between things like what they called cyber terrorism and cyber attacks, and think about how that would be different when we're talking about perhaps nations using cyber weaponry, cyber attacks against each other. Does that count as terrorism, or do we count that as cyber warfare, cyber attacks? Those are things to think about as well. So just think about some of the different perspectives that this video introduced. And one that I thought was really important to think about was how much they also talked about the role of the private sector. So, second discussion question 2. How much of a role should the private sector play in fighting cyber terrorism? Again, discussion question 2. How much of a role should the private sector play in fighting cyber terrorism? All right, so Now we're going to go on to our final video here. And this individual is an expert on cyber terrorism as well. He's a law professor at the University of Utah, and I think he brings some interesting perspectives as well. So without further ado, I will start this video.
Professor Amos Guiora, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
On October 12th, Leon Panetta, who's the former head of the CIA and now the U.S. Secretary of Defense, spoke at a meeting in New York organized by Business Executives for National Security. And he warned in that meeting that the U.S. faces a pre-9/11 moment as far as cybersecurity is concerned. He spoke about the possibility of a cyber Pearl Harbor, in which cyber actors could launch attacks on the country's infrastructure in conjunction with physical attacks. Do you agree with this assessment? And how vulnerable is the U.S. today to such a threat? And what could be its consequences?
I think, first of all, that Secretary Panetta was spot on in terms of highlighting the danger posed by cybersecurity. As we were talking before we started the interview, I think cybersecurity has gone under the radar. And if Secretary Panetta intended to, make it the bold headline Pearl Harbor, I think he was effective and successful in that. In terms of the threats posed by cybersecurity, I don't think there's any doubt that the dangers and risks are enormous. And if he intended this headline-grabbing moment, I think he was right to do that. And I think the discussion subsequent to that has shown how important it is to have this discussion.
Now, if such a cyber attack were to happen, where might it come from and who might the attackers be?
Well, I think, first of all, those who are engaged in cyber terrorism are seriously smart, sophisticated people. So it's a different kind of terrorist than, say, 9/11. It requires a different skill set. It can be from within, it can be from without. It just simply requires having a pretty sophisticated understanding of technology, of how the systems work, and ultimately how to impact them and, God forbid, how to shut them down. And whether, again, as I say, it comes from within or without, I don't think there's any doubt that one thinks about down the road threats, that cybersecurity, cyber terrorism poses an enormous threat.
And would the threat come from, say, nation states, or would they come from loose groups of hackers like Anonymous?
I don't know about Anonymous, but I think it would probably come from, I would think, more from non-state actors than from state actors. And hackers, yes, but obviously really sophisticated hackers. Because if you think, if you think about the kinds of dangers that they pose, whether it's shutting a system down, whether shutting cities down, impacting banking systems, impacting the water flow of a city. It just goes on and on because we are all obviously totally computer dependent. Think about airplanes in the air, right? It just goes on. And I think in that sense, the dangers are so extraordinary. And one of the things that worries me, and I think that's why it's important to have this discussion, is I'm not sure to what extent we as a society fully and truly understand the threat posed by cybersecurity.
But depending on whether it was another nation state that was launching an attack or non-state actors, as you mentioned, what might the defense strategy be, and how would it differ in each of those cases?
I think if it's a nation state that's engaged in a cyber attack, not cyber terrorism, because nation states don't engage in terrorism, right? It would be a cyber attack. I think that'd be equivalent to an act of war. And I think if an act of war is an act of war, and according to Article 51 of the UN Charter, that would certainly enable the attacked nation state to respond to the attacking nation state. If it's a non-state actor, then it would be in the context of counterterrorism, and the response, at least from a legal perspective, as I advocate, would justify the nation state responding aggressively to non-state actors who are engaged in cyber terrorism, which is yet another form of terrorism.
Now, to your mind, which are some of the most dramatic examples of cyber terror attacks in recent times? And what might be some of the lessons that one could draw from the way the situation played out?
I'll give you an example. a number of years ago met with the senior vice president of one of America's largest banks. The bank had been infiltrated / hacked by one guy who was able to wire an extraordinary amount of money after having set up approximately 400 fictitious accounts. And the kinds of money that this one guy through these 400 accounts was wiring was lots of money, all going to terrorism. So there's a direct link between cybersecurity, cyber terrorism, and the financing of terrorism. That is deeply troubling. It was very clear after the conversation with his vice president that his bank, huge bank in the United States, was wholly unprepared and unequipped to respond to this. That for me was a sobering moment.
In fact, it's very interesting you mentioned that example, because even in his speech, Mr. Panetta mentioned that there were some U.S. financial institutions, major institutions, that were very recently targeted for cyber attacks. Can you give us a little, I mean, the kind of attack they faced was the distributed denial of service variety of attacks. Could you speak a little bit about what damage such attacks can inflict upon the institution?
Well, first of all, the fact that somebody is wiring, first of all, setting up fictitious accounts, and then wiring hundreds of millions of dollars to terrorist organizations obviously impacts all of us. But I think maybe more than that, it shows how vulnerable the systems are. And I think if I go back to Secretary Panetta's comments about Pearl Harbor, if you go back to think about Pearl Harbor itself, how how vulnerable the United States was in retrospect. And I think if in his using the phrase Pearl Harbor, it's like a clarion call to understand our vulnerability and to begin baby steps to more effectively protect ourselves. Then to answer your question, and I think that probably is the most important service he could have provided.
Now, unlike ground zero in the case of a physical attack, a cyber attack doesn't leave a crater.
No.
And even when the private sector firms, like the banks you mentioned, have their intellectual property stolen, very often they are not even aware of the fact.
Totally.
How can firms get around this problem, if at all?
I think the first thing that the private sector needs to do, and frankly also government, is to recognize that cyber terrorism, even though it doesn't leave a crater, maybe leaves a larger crater, and to more effectively begin the process of protecting themselves and their assets against some really sophisticated hacking. It probably doesn't have the extraordinary appeal, right, of an attack. At 9/11, the building is blowing up. It's dramatic. A cybersecurity attack is not dramatic. There's no real visual, and visuals are important. But I would think that from the perspective of the private sector, and the example I give you about this bank, if I were a CEO of an major American financial institution, I would say to my relevant vice presidents that in many ways our vulnerability is less or no less our building than our intellectual property, our accounts, money, and that we need to take a pretty serious look at how well we are protecting ourselves, with the understanding that perhaps the answer is we're not protecting ourselves, and then to undertake the process, to begin the process of protecting ourselves from a cyber attack the same way we're protecting ourselves against a physical attack.
Now, American firms are hardly alone in facing these attacks. For example, there have been reports about a virus called Shamoon that infected computer systems at Aramco,
Right.
The Saudi oil company. And similar attacks have also been observed against RasGas in a major energy producer in Qatar.
Right.
So although cyber warfare can take place anywhere in the world,
Sure.
which countries and companies do you think are the most vulnerable to such threats today?
Well, if one believes the various media reports with respect to cyber attacks against Iranian assets last year and the previous year, the Sputniks, then it shows that indeed, as you correctly mentioned, that both states and enterprises are vulnerable. And Iran raises obviously important questions because of the nuclear program and how to convince the Iranians not to go forward with it. And as Sputnik showed, they are vulnerable. I think they probably present a pretty compelling example of a nation state engaged in an act of creating a nuclear industry that, according to some countries, poses a threat to world security, world peace. And then the question becomes, how do you convince them not to go forward? And if the penetration of a virus through cyber is effective in dissuading them from going forward, then I would say A, it shows their vulnerability, and B, maybe that shows the effectiveness of some kind of a cyber attack.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Stuxnet because I was just about to ask about that. As you may know, have seen recently, there was a huge article in the New York Times about the fact that that mentioned that perhaps the U.S. and Israel had collaborated to create that the computer worm,
Right.
with the goal of crippling the Iranian nuclear facility in Natanz. Now, under international law, as it exists today, are such attacks by the U.S. and Israel legal?
On the assumption that indeed the U.S. and or Israel were involved in it, right? That's going to be the assumption. Then I think you can make a pretty viable argument in the context of self-defense that the introduction of this worm or virus would meet various standards of international law for the following reason. Iran has been very clear about two things. One is creating a nuclear industry, and two, a pretty clear articulation of their desire to use the nascent bomb, if it were to be developed, against Israel. And then the question becomes, how does Israel protect itself, and what are the limits of protecting itself in the context of self-defense? So if there's this industry being created, a nuclear program, and these threats, then I would think that an introduction of a virus would meet this test, A, of self-defense, and B, of limited self-defense. And so I think from the perspective of international law, I think that meets those tests.
Stuxnet was detected when it, quote-unquote, escaped from Iran and found its way to the West. According to the New York Times, U.S. officials blamed Israel for this. But regardless of who was responsible and who's at fault, what are the chances that digital bombs like Stuxnet can fall into the wrong hands and then end up being used against the creators? Is there anything that can be done to protect people against
That's
these
why
threats?
one hopes that those who create the worms or the viruses are sophisticated enough to also introduce firewalls to make sure that it doesn't bounce back, right? You don't have a boomerang effect, and therefore you don't have what's good for the goose is good for the gander. That obviously is going to depend on the technical skills and competence of those who are creating the viruses. But there's always a risk whenever you create some kind of an aggressive mechanism. If it falls into the wrong hands, you never know where it's going to potentially end up.
Now, countries like China and Russia are said to be actively developing their cyber capabilities. Now, as cyberspace becomes a war zone, is it realistic to believe that international regulations could be developed to bring about greater transparency? And given the global nature of cyberspace and competing national interests, who would oversee compliance?
That's a great question, and it goes to a larger issue. Let's call it the changing nature of international law, and to what extent is international law relevant to changing forms of technology and warfare. No doubt the issues you're raising here, China, Russia, cyberspace, is probably going to require various international organizations to be more involved in this in terms of international conventions, international treaties, regulating the use of cyber. Here we are in 2012 on the verge of 2013. I think we're a long way off from really fully understanding A, the dangers posed, and B, the benefits perhaps. And it's going to take scholars, academics, the international community, technical people, computer experts to work together to A, understand the limits, and then to create, and need, as you say, some kind of regulatory mechanisms to ensure that these new means are not used nefariously.
Now, in the U.S., some efforts are being made to deal with the legal issues also through initiatives such as the Cybersecurity Act of 2012, which was co-sponsored by Senators Lieberman, Collins, Rockefeller, and Feinstein. Now, the legislation has bipartisan support, as far as I understand, but it has fallen victim to legislative and political gridlock. Could you explain what some of the major hurdles are and what the implications will be if the act becomes law?
Well, first of all, let's begin with the gridlock. There is, here we are on election day, right? There is something called politics in the United States. And issues like this, even though there's bipartisan support, there's always a political end to it, a political aspect to it. A lot of it, obviously, needless to say, is related to the politics of Washington at the moment. Two, going back to how we began our conversation, I think there's still question to what extent we all understand the dangers posed. I think also there are questions in terms of who's going to be, your question about regulatory mechanisms. And I think probably this stage, 2012, 2013, with a new Congress coming in on January 20th, I think we're unfortunately a long way away from, as I said earlier, understanding the benefits and understanding the dangers. And even if there has been legislation introduced, I think unfortunately we're more at a beginning stage than even at a middle stage in terms of understanding this. And I think to that extent, the work ahead of all of us is extraordinarily complex, but simultaneously extraordinarily critical.
I'd like to end with a hypothetical question.
You could be a law professor.
What are the chances of an all-out cyber war between the East and West developing into a conventional war, and what would it take to precipitate it?
So I don't know about war between East and West. I think that paradigm hopefully came to a crashing end in December of '89 when the Berlin Wall came down. But I do think that cyber terrorism, state non-state, cyber war state-state, is perhaps a more realistic option than we would like to think it is a realistic option, and certainly more than it had been 5 years ago. And I think something that, as I said earlier, and I want to emphasize, we need to be much more sensitive to and much more proactive with respect to in terms of establishing very sophisticated firewalls to protect ourselves. There's no doubt that, going back to, I like the term of the crater. The crater left by a cyber attack in many ways is far more dangerous than a physical crater. One, because you don't see it. There's something very disconcerting about that. And shutting down cities, shutting down systems, shutting down banks, the long-term ramifications of that are extraordinary. And again, as I said earlier, to what extent we have begun the process of adequately preparing ourselves, I think that's an open question.
Professor Amos Guerra, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed this last speaker. I think it gave an interesting perspective, especially here at the end where he was discussing the real concern about the consequences of a cyber attack. If you remember back to the first video, the scholar didn't seem to put as much weight into a cyber attack having the same kind of effect, or cyber terrorism having the same kind of effect that traditional terrorist attacks violence does. But here, this individual is posing a different perspective. So again, this comes down to an issue in some ways of perspective. And so to finish off this particular lecture, the third and final discussion question is, do you think a massive cyber terrorism incident like a cyber 9/11 is inevitable? Why or why not? Again, discussion question 3. Do you think a massive cyber terrorism incident like a cyber 9/11 is inevitable? Why or why not? All right, we'll leave it off for there. And as I said in the email, no case study. It's just this video and the 3 discussion questions. So thanks for listening.